Medieval people didn't have much, but they knew how to make food stretch. With simple tools and whatever they could find, they came up with meals that worked. Most of these dishes are long forgotten now, but they fed families for generations. Let's go back and see what they came up with. Back in medieval times, your average person couldn't just walk into a grocery store and grab a loaf of Wonder Bread. If they tried, they'd probably wonder why the store didn't exist yet. Instead, peasants made their own bread using whatever grains they could get their hands on. And spoiler alert, it wasn't the fluffy white stuff we're used to today. Wheat was basically the luxury car of grains back then. Only the wealthy could afford it regularly, so most people turned to rye, barley, or oats instead. These grains were cheaper and more available, but they created dense, heavy loaves that could probably double as doorstops. The bread was so hard that people often had to soak it in soup or ale just to make it chewable. The fermentation process was completely natural, relying on wild yeast floating around in the air. Peasants would keep sourdough starters alive for years, passing them down through generations like family heirlooms. These starters were precious because without them, you'd have flat, brick-like bread that even the chickens would refuse. Most villages had communal ovens because individual families couldn't afford to build and maintain their own. The oven schedule was probably busier than a modern pizza place on Super Bowl Sunday. Families would bring their shaped loaves to the baker, who would slide them into the massive stone ovens using long wooden paddles. When communal ovens weren't available, people got creative. They'd bake their bread on flat stones heated over fires, or even inside large pots buried in hot coals. Some clever bakers used cabbage leaves as natural baking paper, which actually worked surprisingly well and added a subtle flavor to the crust. The thick, hard crust wasn't just a byproduct of the baking process, it served as natural packaging. This tough exterior helped keep the bread fresh longer, which was crucial when you couldn't just run to the store for a new loaf. It looked about as appetizing as a mud brick, but it kept people alive. Despite its rough appearance and challenging texture, this bread was the foundation of medieval meals. People would eat it with everything: soups, stews, cheese, or just plain when times were really tough. It provided the calories and nutrients needed for hard physical labor, even if it wasn't winning any taste contests. From these basic bread-making skills, medieval cooks expanded their creativity to other simple but filling dishes that could stretch limited ingredients into satisfying meals. Medieval cooks had to be masters of making something out of almost nothing, especially during the long winter months when fresh produce was about as rare as honest politicians. Enter pottage, a thick, hearty stew that was basically the Swiss Army knife of medieval cooking. The base of most pottages consisted of onions, turnips, and leeks, vegetables that stored well and were cheap to grow. These weren't exactly the most exciting ingredients, but when you're hungry, turnips start looking pretty appetizing. Families would simmer these vegetables slowly in large iron pots hanging over their fires, filling the house with a smell that was part savory, part survival. Turnips were particularly important because they grew easily in poor soil and could be stored in root cellars through winter. They diced them up with onions and leeks, creating a combination that actually had some serious flavor when cooked long enough. The cooking process was simple but time-consuming. Everything went into one big pot with water, and then you waited. And waited. It was like medieval slow cooking, except your crock pot was made of iron and hung over an actual fire. Salt was expensive, so most pottage relied on herbs for flavor. The beauty of pottage was its flexibility. Running low on turnips? Add more onions. Found some cabbage that was still good? Throw it in. It was the ultimate clean-out-the-pantry meal, centuries before anyone invented that concept. Pottage wasn't just dinner, it was often breakfast and lunch too. Families would keep the pot going all day, adding water and more ingredients as needed. The thick consistency meant it stuck to your ribs, providing the energy needed for farm work. The taste was earthy and filling, though probably not what we'd call exciting today. But when you've been working in the fields all day, a bowl of hot pottage with some crusty bread was genuinely satisfying. Every family probably thought their pottage recipe was the best, leading to some seriously heated vegetable debates. While root vegetables formed the backbone of daily meals, medieval cooks also turned to more unusual ingredients when seasons changed and conventional food became scarce. Spring was a dangerous time in medieval Europe, not because of wars or plagues, but because winter food stores were running dangerously low and new crops hadn't grown yet. This period, called the Hunger Gap, forced people to get creative with whatever edible plants they could find. Enter stinging nettles, the plant that bites back before you eat it. Most people today would rather hug a porcupine than grab a handful of nettles, but medieval cooks knew these prickly weeds were nutritional gold mines. Fresh nettles are packed with iron, vitamin C, and calcium, nutrients that were often lacking in medieval diets, especially after a long winter of eating stored grains. Collecting nettles required some strategy and thick gloves, or at least thick skin. The best time to harvest them was in early spring when the leaves were young and tender. It was like medieval sustainable farming, except the crop fought you every step of the way. The cooking process was actually quite simple once you got past the whole handling plants, that sting part. The key was getting the nettles into boiling water quickly, which neutralized their sting and made them perfectly safe to eat. Most families would boil them with leeks, onions, or garlic to mask the slightly bitter taste. Barley was often added to make the soup more filling and substantial. The grain absorbed the flavors and provided much-needed calories, turning what might have been just green water into an actual meal. Nettle soup was particularly popular during Lent, when meat was forbidden and people needed plant-based nutrition. The Catholic Church's dietary restrictions meant finding creative protein sources, and nettles fit the bill perfectly. Plus, they were free, always an important consideration for medieval budgets. The taste was described as earthy and spinach-like, though probably stronger than modern palates would appreciate. It was like a really painful nature walk, but with dinner at the end. Parents would tell children that nettle soup would make them strong and healthy, which was actually true rather than just parental encouragement. While nettles provided crucial spring nutrition, medieval cooks found other creative ways to make use of everyday ingredients, especially when it came to stretching precious resources like ale. Water in medieval times was about as trustworthy as a weather forecast. You never knew what nasty surprises might be lurking in it. That's why ale became the beverage of choice for most people, including children. Before you start picturing drunk toddlers stumbling around, medieval ale was much weaker than modern beer, with just enough alcohol to kill harmful bacteria. Leftover ale was far too valuable to waste, so creative cooks found ways to incorporate it into meals. Ale broth porridge became a popular breakfast dish that combined the safety of fermented beverages with the heartiness of grain-based meals. It was like having beer for breakfast, except socially acceptable and actually nutritious. The process started with day-old ale that had lost some of its fizz. This was mixed with barley or oats and cooked slowly over the fire until it reached a porridge-like consistency. The cooking process would evaporate most of the alcohol, leaving behind the yeasty, malty flavors that made the grain more palatable. When available, cooks would add dried fruits, herbs, or even a bit of honey to enhance the flavor. Apple pieces were particularly popular as they complemented the malty taste of the ale and added some natural sweetness. The consistency could be adjusted based on preference and available ingredients. Some families preferred it thick enough to eat with a spoon, while others made it thin enough to drink like a warm beverage. It was the medieval equivalent of adjusting your coffee strength, except your coffee was made from fermented grains and yesterday's beer. Children were often given ale broth porridge because it was gentler on their stomachs than straight ale, while still providing the safety benefits of the fermented beverage. The cooking had to be done carefully because nobody wanted to waste precious ale on a burned breakfast. Different regions developed their own variations based on local brewing traditions. Some areas preferred oat-based versions, while others stuck with barley. The type of ale used also affected the final flavor. Stronger ales produced more robust porridges, while weaker ales created milder breakfast dishes. While simple grain porridges sustained daily life, medieval cooks also created more elaborate treats that transformed basic ingredients into special occasion delicacies. Medieval desserts weren't exactly what you'd call sophisticated, but when special occasions rolled around, cooks got creative with whatever sweet ingredients they could find. Sugar was rarer than honest merchants and cost more than most people made in a month, so honey became the go-to sweetener for anyone wanting to make something special. Making cheese from scratch sounds complicated today, but medieval cooks could whip up fresh curds faster than you could say artisanal dairy product. The process was surprisingly simple. They'd heat milk and add vinegar or lemon juice, causing the proteins to separate into curds and whey. Once the curds formed, they'd be drained through cloth to remove excess liquid. The resulting soft cheese had a mild, slightly tangy flavor that paired perfectly with honey's sweetness. Some cooks would mash in seasonal fruits like berries or apples, creating colorful fillings that looked festive. The pastry was basic but effective, flour mixed with lard and just enough water to hold everything together. Plus, lard was readily available from the family pig, assuming they were lucky enough to have one. These tarts were baked in small individual portions, either in metal pans for wealthy households or simple clay dishes for everyone else. The combination of sweet honey and tangy cheese created a flavor profile that was both familiar and exciting. It was like an ancient version of sweet and salty snacks, except with more effort involved. Different regions developed their own variations based on available ingredients and local preferences. The preparation often became a family activity, with children helping to stir the curds or shape the pastry. Teaching kids to cook was essential because takeout wouldn't be invented for several more centuries. The vinegar used in these tarts was often homemade from leftover ale or wine, creating a circular economy where nothing went to waste. Honey and vinegar curd tarts represented the medieval approach to celebration, taking ordinary ingredients and transforming them into something that felt luxurious and special. Moving from these sweet treats to more substantial fare, medieval cooks also elevated basic ingredients into dishes that showcased both skill and expensive imported components. Rice in medieval Europe was like owning a sports car today. Expensive, impressive, and definitely not something you'd see in every household. Most rice had to be imported from distant lands, making it a luxury ingredient that only appeared on wealthy tables or during very special occasions. When medieval cooks got their hands on some rice, they weren't making simple side dishes. They were creating masterpieces. The combination of rice with bone marrow might sound strange to modern ears, but it made perfect sense in medieval kitchens. Bone marrow was rich, creamy, and packed with fat, essential calories for people who burned energy like medieval furnaces. The cooking process required patience and skill. Rice had to be cooked slowly and carefully, with constant stirring to prevent burning. Medieval cooks would often use almond milk instead of regular milk, which added another layer of luxury and expense. Almond milk wasn't a trendy health food back then, it was genuinely expensive and exotic. Bone marrow was extracted from large bones and carefully incorporated into the rice as it cooked. The marrow would melt and distribute throughout the dish, creating a creamy texture that was both rich and satisfying. Sweetening came from honey or, for the truly wealthy, imported sugar. Spices like saffron, nutmeg, or cinnamon might be added, each one representing a significant investment. A single pinch of saffron cost more than most people earned in a day, so using it was basically like seasoning your food with gold flakes. The dish was often thickened with breadcrumbs made from the finest white bread or enriched with egg yolks for extra richness. It would be presented in fine bowls, often garnished with whole spices for the wealthiest households. The presentation was probably more elaborate than most modern desserts, except social media wouldn't be invented for about 700 years. The cost of ingredients meant that this dish was reserved for truly special occasions, religious holidays, weddings, or visits from important guests. Making rice pudding with bone marrow was basically the medieval equivalent of breaking out the good china. From these elaborate rice dishes for the wealthy, medieval cooks also mastered the art of transforming everyday leftovers into delicious treats that could grace any table. Throwing away food in medieval times was about as common as finding a unicorn in your backyard. It just didn't happen. Every scrap had value, and stale bread was no exception. Medieval families would rather eat their own shoes than waste perfectly good bread, and sometimes the texture wasn't that different. When bread got too hard to chew comfortably, clever cooks transformed it into bread pudding using ale and whatever fruits they had available. Apples were particularly popular because they stored well through winter, and their natural sweetness complemented the malty flavors of the ale. The process started with breaking up stale bread into chunks and soaking it in ale until it became soft and mushy. It looked about as appetizing as wet cardboard, but medieval cooks knew that appearance wasn't everything. The ale not only softened the bread, but also added complex flavors that transformed the humble base into something special. Chopped apples were mixed in, along with any available spices or sweeteners. Honey was the preferred sweetener when available, though some families made do with dried fruits like raisins or currants for added sweetness. Eggs served as binding agents when families could afford them, creating puddings with a more custard-like texture. Some versions were so thick you could practically use them as building materials, but they tasted much better than actual mortar. The cooking method varied based on available equipment. Wealthy households might bake their bread puddings in proper ovens, while poorer families often boiled their puddings in cloth bags suspended in large pots. Different types of ale created different flavor profiles in the finished pudding. Medieval cooks were basically doing flavor pairing centuries before it became a fancy culinary concept. The texture was denser and more substantial than modern versions, meant to be filling and satisfying rather than just sweet treats. The best bread puddings came from using different types of stale bread together, creating complex textures and flavors that kept each bite interesting. While bread puddings made the most of stale leftovers, medieval preservation techniques also allowed cooks to enjoy the flavors of summer fruits throughout the harsh winter months. Fresh fruit was a seasonal luxury in medieval times. When it was ripe, you had more than you could eat, and when it wasn't, you had none at all. Medieval people couldn't just pop into the grocery store for out-of-season fruit, so they had to get creative about making summer bounty last through winter. Pickling became one of the most effective preservation methods, and it worked just as well for fruits as it did for vegetables. Plums and pears were particularly good candidates because they held their shape well during the pickling process, and their flavors actually improved with the addition of vinegar and spices. The process started with selecting fruits that were ripe but still firm. Medieval cooks had to time their preserving activities perfectly, working quickly when fruits reached that perfect stage of ripeness. Vinegar was the key preservative, creating an acidic environment that prevented spoilage. The vinegar had to be potent enough to preserve the fruit, which meant the final product could probably wake the dead with its intensity. Spices like cloves, cinnamon, and ginger transformed the pickled fruits from simple preserved foods into genuine delicacies. The cooking process involved simmering the fruits gently in spiced vinegar until they were tender but not falling apart. Medieval cooks had to watch their pots more carefully than new parents watched their babies. Storage was crucial for success. The pickled fruits were packed into ceramic jars, completely covered with the spiced vinegar solution. These preserved fruits could accompany meat dishes, adding acidic brightness that cut through rich, fatty flavors. Plus, they probably helped prevent scurvy, though medieval people didn't know what scurvy was. They just knew pickled fruits made them feel better. Different regions developed their own specialties based on local fruit varieties and available spices. Sugar was rarely used because of its extreme cost. The natural sugars in the fruits, combined with the preservative effects of vinegar and spices, were sufficient to create flavorful preserved foods that could sustain families through lean months. Just as fruits needed preservation for winter eating, medieval cooks also developed ways to make the most of fresh meat when animals were slaughtered, creating sausages that provided protein and flavor. Medieval butchering was a nose-to-tail affair long before it became a trendy restaurant concept. When you slaughtered an animal, you used absolutely everything, and that included organ meats that many modern people won't touch. Liver was particularly valuable because it was packed with nutrients even if it tasted like someone had seasoned iron filings. Liver sausage became a clever way to make organ meat more palatable while creating a protein-rich food that could feed families for several meals. The process involved chopping liver finely and mixing it with fat, onions, and whatever herbs were available. The fat was crucial for providing flavor and making the liver less intensely flavored. Medieval cooks discovered that onions could make almost anything taste better, which explains why they're still popular today. Garlic, parsley, thyme, and sage were other common additions that contributed both flavor and perceived health benefits. The mixture was traditionally wrapped in animal intestines, which served as natural casings. Before you get grossed out, remember that modern sausages still use intestine casings. We just prefer not to think about it. Families that couldn't access proper casings would wrap their sausage mixture in large cabbage leaves. Cooking methods varied based on available equipment. Some sausages were roasted over open fires, creating crispy exteriors and juicy interiors. Others were boiled in large pots, resulting in more tender textures. The cooking method often depended on whether you wanted to impress guests or just feed the family without setting anything on fire. Strong spices were essential for masking the sometimes overwhelming flavor of liver. Black pepper was highly prized for this purpose when available. The finished sausages had to be consumed relatively quickly since refrigeration wouldn't be invented for several more centuries. It was the original use it or lose it situation, except losing it meant going hungry. Different regions developed their own liver sausage traditions based on local animals and available seasonings. Each region probably claimed their version was the best, leading to medieval food feuds that were surprisingly passionate. Making liver sausage was often a communal activity, with several families working together when animals were slaughtered, sharing both the work and the results. While animal products provided essential protein, medieval cooks also mastered vegetarian dishes that used foraged ingredients available to anyone with knowledge of the local landscape. Foraging was serious business in medieval times. Knowing which wild foods were safe could mean the difference between a good meal and a very permanent dirt nap. Mushrooms were particularly tricky because some varieties could end your worries about dinner permanently, while others were absolutely delicious. Experienced foragers developed encyclopedic knowledge of local fungi, passing down this life or death information through generations. Mushroom and oatcakes became popular in areas where wild mushrooms grew abundantly and families had access to oats. The combination created filling, flavorful patties that could serve as main courses or hearty side dishes. It was like medieval veggie burgers, except they actually tasted good, and nobody had to pretend they were meat.